Well, welcome to the Crook in the Book podcast, where three pastor friends discuss the Bible, how it connects to life and local church ministry. I'm Luke Miller. I'm here with my coworkers and friends, Jeremy Muncie and Andrew Balich. So today we're going to be discussing something related to the message on Sunday, and that is how to use wisdom when it comes to extra biblical rules. Before we get into that, let me just remind you, listeners, we really like to hear from you. Questions you have, topics you'd like to hear us discuss, please feel free to go to our website, westwoodcma.org, go to resources, click on Crook in the Book, and you can submit any question you have there about the Bible or the Christian life, and we'll do our best to work that in and give our shot at an answer for you. All right, so guys, let's go ahead and get into it. Start with this question. Start with you, Andrew. Can you talk for a moment about just what's the difference between biblical and extra biblical rules?
Sure, that's kind of a softball question. One is found in the Bible, and the other one is not, right? One is from God, and one is from man. So there's a clear distinction there, but I think it's also helpful to think, even when we're saying biblical rules, I think what we really mean are those that apply to everyone,
Right.
And there are certain cases, like some of the Old Testament laws for Israel that are rules, don't apply to New Testament Christians. There are rules that are general rules in, like, the book of Proverbs, for instance, that certainly there are times and places where there would be maybe exceptions to them. So when we talk about biblical rules versus man-made rules, I think that the heart of it is what are we all compelled to do that's a rule, and what are things that are added by human beings.
Right.
Anything to add, Jeremy?
No, I think that's good. I think sometimes in our minds, we like to try to. I think we overcomplicate things. You know what I mean? And at the end of the day, there are rules that all Christians are expected to live by in the Bible, and those are biblical rules. And then there are rules that some Christians choose to implement for certain people in certain situations, and those would be man-made rules. But you could also include non-Christians in that too. You could look at the society we live in, the culture we live in. We have rules, we have laws in our country, in our state, even in our city, those kinds of things. So those are man-made rules. Sometimes they overlap with God's rules, and sometimes they don't.
Mm-hmm. So here's a follow-up question then. Why not just follow God-given rules then and stay away from man-made ones? It seems like that would be easier, right? Let's just follow the God-given rules and not even worry about the man-made ones. What would you say to that, Jeremy?
Yeah, I mean, I would love it if it was that simple, but it really isn't. I think God has given us each wisdom. He's given us minds. He's given us different situations that he has us in. There are some rules that are for some people and during some eras and some times, even that he lays down. Do you know what I mean? That don't apply to everyone. And so I think you need rules that maybe aren't long-standing rules like thou shalt not murder or don't take the Lord's name in vain. You need certain rules in order for there to be order. Do you know what I mean? In order for there
Sure.
to be,
yeah.
You can really look at like two P's that you're after when it comes to man-made rules. One is protection. You want rules that help protect particular people in particular circumstances. So let's say your child, you live next to a really busy street. Well, you probably tell your kid, I don't want you going too far from the front porch of the house, and maybe set a limit, like a tree in the yard or something like that. That's a particular rule for that kid. Now, if that kid lives in a rural setting out on a 1,000-acre farm and his house is a mile off the road almost, he's going to have a whole lot more space. His the rules for that kid are going to be different. Do you know what I mean? So you want rules that are protective, and those apply to certain people in certain situations. But also, the second P that you're after is production. You want rules that help us be productive. So, for example, if you were to have a church meeting and everyone just kind of spoke. No one raised, no, there was no like unwritten rule even that you raise your hand or you follow Robert's rule of order or whatever that's called. Well, that meeting is going to
Bob's rules.
Yeah, Bob's rules. Yeah, I'm not a big Robert's Rule of Order guy. Andrew knows that, but Andrew's very good at it, so I'm happy for that.
Yeah, yes,
but in all seriousness, those kinds of things are nice because you get a lot more accomplished. There's less chaos. There's more order, and things can function. And so, I don't know if that's helpful or not. Andrew, you got anything you want to add to that?
I would just say some specific examples, that we've run into as a church, getting some pushback on, even that fall into those categories. We have rules at Westwood about who is and is not allowed to have weapons on the premises, for instance, underneath the guidance of our security team, who we trust.
Like I'm allowed, but Luke isn't. Because
that kind of thing.
No, I'm just kidding. I'm not even allowed. I don't even have a CCW.
That would actually be a good rule. But anyway,
yeah. This guy's. I trust this guy, but not that guy. I don't think
you don't want me on the security team. Anyway,
but that's one that we've gotten some pushback on, and it's there for protection. But no, there's not a chapter and verse that supports that.
Right.
Child check-in system, for instance. We want background checks for people who work with children, and we want kids to check in so we know where people are. And have that for safety purposes. And, we don't have a chapter and verse for that, but that falls under that
protection
part of protection.
Production.
There's productive things we do. This is a silly one, but we wanted the flow of traffic to go one way up the stairs and then down the stairs and then back up the stairs, right? While we were in this building transition, not because it's morally binding, right? Somewhere from the Bible, but because it's more productive to not have people going two ways into like a funnel, So we do things all the time and set up rules that are there for the purposes of protection and production.
And what's interesting is that rule, even the stair rule, it's just for a season for a particular people in a particular circumstance. We're going to be in a new building soon where that flow, it's not going to matter. You know what I mean? And so people can go up or down the stairs or whatever. It doesn't, you know what I mean? So yeah. And you got to recognize the difference between a man-made rule and a God-made rule. And we have a tendency as human beings to take our rules and to try and put them in the place kind of at least close to the same level as God's rule. Jesus was talking about that in Mark chapter 7.
But also when we're underneath someone else's authority, we do need to submit to the rules that are in place for protection and production, even when they're not God's rules, even when maybe we would do it differently. We are choosing to be a part of a collective where there is people in places of authority that are trying to do their best wisely for the group, for the church. And so, maybe you thought the traffic flow should go the other direction, but guess what? It's okay. Just submit to it, even though that's has nothing to do with, whether it would be morally right or wrong to do it another way. The question is, where has God placed you? And are those things for your good? And, traffic violations, you use that in your sermon on Sunday. There's a lot of places that I think should be 45 instead of 35, but I, choose to have the privilege of driving and do that. So I need to abide by those,
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. It seems like it's safe to say one reason that we don't only just try to follow God-given rules and have to incorporate man-made rules is because it's just kind of necessary. Like it's not really possible to live your life and to attempt to even apply all of God's rules without coming up with some specifics of how that's going to play out in your life or in your church or community or whatever it might be. But the key, right, as we're hitting that, and I think we're gonna get on to this later, but the key is to recognize when is this a clear area where everyone needs to look the same, like don't steal or something like that. When does it have more to do with kind of the protection side of that? Like maybe avoiding the temptation to steal, let's say. That might look different for different people and have to be, each person is working out their salvation and figuring out what this is going to look like in their context. So speaking of that, I think it's important we talk here a moment about legalism and how it's connected to all of this. So Andrew, I'm going to have you start with this. Maybe start with, how would you define legalism? I think some of us might define that in different ways. And then how do you see it connected to all of this discussion?
Yeah, I think legalism is trying to justify ourselves by our works, and we can do that really with God-given rules or man-made rules. But specifically in this discussion, I think the biggest danger is taking our man-made rules and seeing our meeting of those as elevating us to gain favor with God more than other people, looking down on other people because of it, or universally applying those situational things in our own lives to the lives
Right.
of others. But I think legalism at its heart gets to, how am I justified? How am I righteous before the Lord? Is it because of my performance or not? And if it's because of my performance, that's legalism.
No, that's good. I'd be in agreement. I think, whenever we feel better about ourselves before God because of some rule or something that we are doing that we think is earning us favor with God, if we're not being legalistic, we're dangerously close to being legalistic. Not that we shouldn't feel good when we do good works. I'm not saying that. I think there should be joy in our hearts when we're functioning the way that God has designed us to function and commands us to function. But it's when we're like, yeah, God owes me. You know what I mean? God owes me because I did this, or God owes me because I didn't do that. In fact, I didn't just obey His law. I made an extra law to protect His law, and I kept that. I'm better. I'm better than I was, and I'm better than maybe that guy over there that doesn't have that law in his life and doesn't follow that law is. I think that's the heart of a legalist. A legalist is pride, or legalism is pride, and so it's good.
Yeah, and I think there's a surface level aspect of that, and then there's a heart level aspect of that. You can sometimes look at yourself and see, okay, like I've come up with a bunch of extra biblical rules. What's going on here? But really, what it boils down to is where's your heart at? You know what I mean? Do I really deep down believe that it's Christ, His righteousness that justifies me, or do I think there's something I can do, biblical or extra biblical, something I can do that will justify me? And I think, if we start to see a lot of fear in our relationship with God, like lack of assurance of salvation, or lots of extra biblical rules popping up all the time, it's probably a good idea to check our heart and say, what am I trusting in? Who am I trusting in? Myself? You know what I mean? It's possible to have mostly correct theology on the surface, but not to be resting in that in your heart. At least that's been very true in my own experience.
Yeah, it's good.
It's really good.
All right. So Jeremy, what would you say are some things to keep in mind? What are some things to keep in mind when dealing with man-made rules in your own life, in your family, in your church, wherever else? What do you think?
Well, I think first, keep in mind that the purpose of a man-made rule should be to protect or to produce, you know what I mean, in a God-honoring way. And so you got to ask yourself, is this rule, is it really helpful? Is it actually protecting people from harm? And is it actually productive? Is it actually accomplishing something for the good of these people, or for my own good? And I think you have to recognize every person is different, and really the person you should have the most rules for really should be yourself. And if you're a parent, maybe, of course, young children would have a lot of rules in place until they reach a certain maturity level or whatever. I get that. But rather than having a bunch of rules for your friends or your church or the society that you're expecting all these people to follow, really, I think you should have the most rules for yourself, because you know yourself the best. And so you got to take into account personality. You got to take into account weaknesses. You got to take into account the situation that you're in. You know what I mean? And so this is hard. It's hard to come up with meaningful, helpful rules for a group of people, especially because you have all these different people that have different consciences, different strengths, different flaws. So all those things you have to keep in mind to answer your question. When you're making a man-made rule, you got to keep in mind all of the various personalities and people and circumstances that are involved, and then ask the Lord for wisdom to put certain boundaries in place that are going to help those people glorify Him. And if you see a rule that just seems like we just have that rule to have that rule. I'm sure you've met people like this. I mean, how many of us have met someone who's like, why is this rule even here? It just seems like this rule is just here to have a rule about something. It's probably not a good rule. Do you know what I mean? But if you hear a rule and you think to yourself, oh, that makes sense, well, then that's a rule that maybe you want to tease out a little bit more and see, okay, does it? And likely it does. Maybe your rule is, I don't know. Maybe your rule is that you can't have, I use this example, you can't have social media in our house until you're 18 years old. Okay, well, does that rule make sense? Think about some of the dangers of social media. This idea of, kids are finding their identity and how cool they are and how many likes they have and how many follows and all these different things. Well, would that protect my kid maybe a little bit from that? Yeah. Okay. Well, that makes a little bit of sense. But you might have a kid. But here's the hard thing. Don't look down on the guy that doesn't have that rule, because you might have a kid that lives across the street. He's not tied up into all of that online identity stuff and all, you know what I mean? Like, and he can have social media and he's fine. He's not addicted to it or finding his value in it.
Yeah, I think another thing to keep in mind too is that because these are areas of Christian wisdom and they are situational, that not only do we not want to impose our man-made rules, whether it's personal or family or church, on other persons, families, or churches, but also just to be okay with it being different. Like maybe my household does have a rule that's a little more strict than somewhere else, but that doesn't mean I need to drop mine just because somebody else doesn't have them either.
Right.
So we're dealing, there's things like, because of being in pastoral ministry, I've never heard a godly pastor who I trust give me any other advice other than don't be alone with a woman who's not your wife.
Yeah.
And so is that true for every situation in every line of work and all? No, it's not. And just because somebody else maybe is doing that doesn't mean it's a good idea for me to do it. Right. So things like the stuff we let our kids watch right now, we've got family members that will allow their kids to do things that we won't allow our kids to do. There was a animated series of Jurassic Park that Lizzie loved because she was in a dinosaur phase. And, the first 4 seasons of it were totally benign and fine. And then all of a sudden they started introducing some of the cultural nonsense into it with gender issues and relationships, wokeism, that kind of thing. And so no, we're not going to watch that. And even if your friends at school are talking about it, we're not going to watch it. Not because, again, to the point of it being situational, that when she's 16, 17, she couldn't watch something that has a, sitcom with a same-sex couple or something. But right now, I don't want imagination being captured or being comfortable in any way with it. So just being sure before the Lord, I guess. Apply the wisdom and don't enforce it on other people, but also don't just assume that they're not necessary in your life for the people you're responsible for because somebody else has a different one too. Cuts both ways, I guess, I'm saying.
Yeah. No, that's good.
Yeah. No, I think 2 things I keep in mind are I need to be ruthlessly honest with myself about what extra biblical rules I need to walk in holiness before the Lord. And then I need to be very slow to jump to conclusions about what other people need. And in particular, what their motives are and what they're, doing. So I don't know, a common one would be like entertainment. I have some specific rules for myself of what I think helps me avoid sin in that area. But if I talk to another person who has a different approach, I just need to be very slow of assuming, they must be, their heart must not be in the right place.
Right.
And there's a time if you have this kind of relationship to ask the person, are you sure you're okay with that or whatever it might be? Is that doing good things for you? But then again, the whole point of asking the question is you don't assume that they're wired just like you, or that their temptations look exactly what yours look like. But yeah, and that applies obviously to a whole host of areas. All right,
Well,
Andrew.
and then I was going to say too, and we don't feel better about ourselves because we have a rule in place that they don't have in place. And I think that's such a tendency. And I see this in Christians. I've even seen it in myself at times, where you're almost like bragging about the rules that you have for yourself or for your family. Yeah, the kids the other day wanted to watch that, woke dinosaur show, and but I've done that kind of thing. You know what I mean? Where you're just like you're kind of throwing it out there how holy you are, that you have certain rules, and I think we got to be careful with that. You know what I mean? That we just really watch our hearts, like you said, that we're honest with ourselves when we're coming up with rules about what rules we should have, because I think some of us need to have better rules in place for managing our own sanctification and our own lives. And we need to be honest with ourselves about that. But at the same time, we need to be very, very humble when it comes to the way that we look at others and the way that we approach interaction with other people when it comes to these rules. Because it's a tendency I see, and I see it in good Christians. I think sometimes some of the best Christians, when they're young in the faith, are extremely idealistic. You know what I mean by that? Like they have
Sure.
rules and standards for themselves because they love the Lord so much, they want to honor him. And what that can easily do though for them is it can cause them to look down on other people that either don't have those rules or just maybe honestly aren't as mature yet. And maybe they should have some of those rules in place and they don't, but that's not up for us to judge. That's up to them, and that's between them and the Lord. So anyways, gotta watch out for that.
Yeah, that's good.
I know I do.
No, same here. So Andrew, last question on this topic. What is the difference, what would you say? What is the difference between a helpful and a good man-made rule and a bad one? How do we discern the difference between what makes a man-made rule helpful and not helpful?
Yeah, I think we've kind of said it in different ways, but as simply as I can put it, one makes you honor the Lord and one makes you dishonor him. Right? And, you look at what the Pharisees in our passage in Mark chapter 7 this past Sunday, where the Pharisees got hung up with this whole Corban thing, right? I mean, the rule, devoting your money to God, sure, that's fine.
Good thing.
But not when it comes to the expense of your obligation to your parents or your family or whatever. That's dishonors the Lord. The Pharisees as well that we see have this tendency to, steer as far clear as they can from sinners. And Jesus is not happy about that, right? They're the ones who need the truth, that need a savior, that need a loving influence in that way in their lives. And so they're dishonoring the Lord by their rules. It may be good and helpful in some occasions, but they're so strict with them that they're not even around sinners to be able to share the truth and the love of God with them. So I think at the end of the day, ask yourself, is this man-made rule further me honoring the Lord or not? I think that's kind of the litmus test.
Yeah. And I would say too, I think sometimes that rule can be good for you in a certain season of your life, but maybe not good in another. And I think you have to reevaluate those sorts of things. When you're 7, it's probably a good idea to have certain boundaries on your own heart and soul, and hopefully your parents help enforce those. But maybe when you're 27, there's I don't know too many parents that are like, hey, here, Johnny, have a beer. When he's 7 years old, but maybe when he's 27, that's something he can do and still honor the Lord. So, yeah, I think Andrew kind of hit the nail on the head. I think a good man-made rule actually fosters your faith, actually helps you in your walk with the Lord. You know what I mean? A bad one, at the worst, can hurt you in your faith, keeping you from obeying real laws of God. And sometimes a bad one, even at best, is just unnecessary. Do you know what I mean? It's just there for no good reason.
hindrance. Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks, guys. Listeners, just a reminder again, feel free to send us in your questions. It could be a follow-up question on this topic. It could be something completely different. westwoodcma.org/resources, Crook in the Book. All right. Here's a random question. Not as random as usual. It's actually pretty connected this time. But here's the question. What is a rule you had growing up in your house?
We had a number of rules growing up. Probably the one that deprived me the most as a child was not being able to watch The Simpsons. For whatever reason, my folks were
Same.
on the warpath against The Simpsons. Another one, which I've watched some of The Simpsons now because I didn't grow up watching it. It's not as entertaining to me, so I've never watched them all or anything like that. But I watch them and it's just like, oh, I can see why that probably wouldn't have been sanctifying when I was little. The other one, though, I wasn't allowed to watch Home Alone either, because the kid was disrespectful to his parents. And I look back on it and I have watched Home Alone and I'm like, this really doesn't seem that bad. I don't. Yeah, I'm not sure.
When I look back at my life and the sins of my life, most of them I can trace back to Home Alone. I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, right. Well, hey, there you go. They spared me.
Oh no, I get it. Yeah.
But you, Jeremy?
The one that stands out the most in my mind is we weren't allowed to say the F word growing up. And what I mean by that is not the F word you're thinking of, but another F word that has to do with passing gas. We weren't allowed to use that word for gas. You know what I mean? And so...
and he's still not using it. Notice, listener.
Well, my mother may listen to this, and if she does, my parents, thinking back about it, it's like my parents, we had certain rules in place. Don't get me wrong, but my parents, I think, did a really good job navigating those waters. I never felt like, man, why do we have all these stupid rules? I really didn't. So I guess that would be the one. We weren't allowed to refer to flatulence as the other F word.
Oh man. So we were speaking of Home Alone, we weren't allowed to watch Dennis the Menace, I believe, for similar reasons. Disrespectful young man.
That's so good.
Didn't honor his parents. The other rule that my mom, this one was only applied to me in particular, to my knowledge, but
you needed it.
I did it as a kid. I was
Let me hear it.
I was a serious bookworm. I'm sure listeners will be shocked to hear that. And I would spend, hours upon hours reading books to the detriment of my homeschool studies. And so my mom had to put limitations on how long I was allowed to read books about, people living on riverboats and stuff like that. That captured my young imagination. But yeah, that was a hard but necessary rule.
That was not a rule my parents had for me.
Oh man. All right. Well, it's been good, guys. Thank you all for joining us. Join us again in a couple of weeks for another episode of The Crook in the Book. I would tell you who our music is by, but it's not playing for some reason. Our producer, however, is Tommy Musias. Maybe he'll be able to fix that for us. And join us again in a couple of weeks. Talk to you then.